Friends of the programme indeed. Peter Tatchell, human rights activist, and John Gaunt, radio host and columnist. Welcome to you both. Peter, can we kick off with you, please? A person born as a male, the advantages that brings in speed, in power, going up against a female in a combat-heavy sport such as rugby, injuries and potentially serious ones are going to happen.
Well, let's be really, really clear. Trans women, there's no real scientific evidence that they have an advantage. What science there is disputed, and the degree of advantage is very minimal. If we look at women athletes or women rugby players in general, lots of them have other advantages over other players. So, for example, some women rugby players have fast twitch muscle fibers, which enables them to run faster with a better chance of scoring a goal. Others have longer legs, which enables them to jump higher to grab the ball. Others have extra large hearts and lungs, which means that they have greater resilience and energy and power. But none of these biological born women have been penalized. It's only the trans women who are being penalized. And in fact, the scientific evidence does seem to suggest that those trans women will actually be at a disadvantage competing against non-trans women, because they will find that the non-trans women have muscles that are more fatigue resistant and recover faster, and therefore have a competitive edge over the trans woman in the sport.
Okay.
And the final point I'd make is that, of course, there is a risk of injury, but there are rules, and also among non-trans women rugby players, some are small, some are large. Already women are at risk of injury. This is quite an aggressive sport. And the fact is that some trans women will be quite petite and will not. They'll be petite, born male,
okay,
petite, and even though they transition, they won't have huge hulking bodies at all.
John, if a trans woman is legally recognised as a woman, has testosterone levels more comparable to a woman than a man, and wants to represent women in rugby, is it wrong to stand in their way?
It's absolutely ridiculous. I had to check my diary that it's not April the 1st. There's women's rugby, which is at a very high standard now, and it's coming to its own. And I applaud it and enjoy watching it. And there's male rugby as well. I'm afraid if you're biologically born a man, you should play with men, not with women. I mean, Peter's knowledge of rugby seems to be very slight. He says it's about scoring goals. It's about scoring tries, isn't it? And also he talks about smaller women, smaller men. Ever since the introduction of people like Jonah Lomo, the great New Zealand Maori player, rugby for men particularly has got bigger and bigger. These men are huge in male rugby, and a similar way going now in female rugby. If you now put a biologically born man into female rugby, Piers Morgan is absolutely right this time, will get mass injuries. It's a ludicrous suggestion. It will only affect a couple of people anyway. It shouldn't be allowed. And what's very interesting about this debate is that the World Rugby Union is against this. England, it's the English Rugby Union who are being really politically correct and saying it's okay, but not at international level. Up to international level, they're saying that this nonsense can carry on. This is just twisting the agenda. It's just trying to move the agenda on. I'm sorry, it's a nonsense. It shouldn't be entertained. Women will end up getting injured. Why can't women have their sport without biologically born men trying to interfere with it? It's just more of this radical men's movement, which is what the trans movement is all about. I'm with the biological women on this. I have a bit of experience because my school, Bluecoat in Coventry, was one of the first schools in the country to pioneer female rugby. And I think it's a great sport, and we need to encourage it and develop it. If you're biologically born a man, go and play with the men. Simple as that.
Peter, what do you say to women who come out and say we simply don't want this. We're fearful for what this could bring, not only in rugby. We've seen Olympic swimmers also coming out and saying this is against what we went into sport for, because we don't want somebody just transitioning essentially over a number of months and coming in and breaking records, as they have done in other sports, particularly in college sports in the US. Are the rights of women not worth as much as trans women?
Well, everybody's rights are important, and I understand the concerns of biologically born women. Their concerns are totally legitimate, and I sympathise and empathise with them. But we have to go with the evidence. And if the evidence suggests that trans women do not have a significant advantage, and
Don't
no
have a
more
massive advantage. They were born as men.
no more an advantage than biologically born women who have fast twitch muscle fibers, long legs, or extra large hearts, then I don't think they should be penalised.
Peter, it's a physical sport, more physical than football. It's a sport which you excel at the bigger you are. So if a biologically born man who's transing into a woman plays, they will have a massive advantage. The best example is to look at Jonah Lomo and the way he changed the male game. The biologically born male will have a massive advantage. There is no need for this. This is just the radical trans movement trying to push their agenda. And let's be honest, Peter, many female rugby players and trans people don't want this. This is just the radical arm, the militant arm, again, trying to get some headlines.
Well, I think we need to acknowledge that not all trans women form a particular body shape or size. There are plenty of trans women who are petite and feminine, who are comparable in weight and size to their biologically born female counterparts.
Who want to
So
play
we
rugby.
shouldn't have a blanket rule. We shouldn't have a blanket rule. We shouldn't assume that all trans women are going to be these 6'5", 200-pound monsters that you seem to suggest. We need to assess.
Well,
I agree. We need to assess.
Have you watched rugby, Peter? Have you watched rugby? It's the same as swimming. When Sharon Davis talks about this, biologically born women now are at a disadvantage. World records are being set by people who were born as men. This is just plain wrong. What about those women, biologically born women, who have dedicated their life to their sport? And then some fella who possibly couldn't make it in men's rugby, wasn't at that level, is a trans person, and then can play in women's rugby. It's not right, Peter. It's not right. And then there's the physical thing, as Piers Morgan says, there will be injuries. It's a tough physical game. Even as a big man myself,
John, we'll just let Peter respond to those women. Okay, we'll just let Peter respond. But Peter, while you do, perhaps would you concede that it perhaps looks a little strange that it all seems, the direction of traffic all seems to be in one way? You've got biological men going into women's sports, but it's very rare, if at all, that I've seen in professional sports for biological women moving into men's sports.
Well, I agree, but the case does not fall or sustain on that basis. As I mentioned earlier, biologically born women have an advantage in sport because they are more resistant to muscle fatigue and they recover faster. So actually, a biologically born woman athlete has an advantage over a trans woman athlete. Yet no one is complaining about that.
At rugby?
Well, of course, because rugby requires sustainability of strength and endurance over a long period of time for the whole game of the match.
It also relies on physical presence. It relies on weight. Most rugby players, I'll talk about men for a moment, in the men's game, they're technically, if you look at their BMI, obese. Of course, they're not obese. It's all muscle. It's mostly about muscle and weight, Peter. Even the backs, when I played rugby, I was a forward because of the size of me. Nowadays, the backs are built the same kind of size. And it's the same in the women's game. I'm sorry. If a man comes in, a biologically born man who becomes a woman, who is attempting to be, and let's remember it, in the Olympics, you don't even have had to have full transitioned. You can just identify, and then as a biologically born man, you can then compete in women's sport. No one's thinking about the women here, and this is why I say the militant arm of the trans movement is actually a radical men's movement. It's nothing to do with the women. You are treating women unequally, Peter, and you're meant to be in human rights and equality. You are treating women and women's sports people as second-class citizens.
Peter, the last 20 seconds to you.
Well, I just say that, lots of different athletes will have advantages because of various physical attributes. Why should we single out the potential advantages that trans women have while ignoring the other advantages that other women have? That is not fair.
John, you want your last 10 seconds?
They're men. They're biologically men, born as men. They're men. They've got a huge advantage over women. The women's sport is a brilliant sport. It's coming into its own. It's different in many ways to male rugby, but it's equal but different. But I'm sorry, Peter, people like you and people like the radical men's movement in the trans arm, the militant arm, they are trying to demean women and they are trying to devalue the female sport. It's unfair, it's wrong, and it shouldn't be allowed.
John Gaunt, talk show host, columnist, and Peter Tatchell, human rights activist. Thank you both for a spirited discussion this evening.